Beneath the dark waters of the Mediterranean lies an entire Egyptian city, its temples shattered, its ships buried in mud, and its colossal statues staring silently through the depths. For centuries, Thonis Heracleion was believed to be little more than a legend. Then archaeologists found its streets beneath the sea. Before we descend into this forgotten gateway to ancient Egypt, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy lost cities, archaeology, and the mysteries history still cannot fully explain. The first thing the divers see is not a city. It is darkness, green and heavy, pressing close around the lamps. The water of Abu Kirbe rarely offers a grand revelation. The lost port emerges piece by piece, the edge of a carved block under a skin of silt, the curve of a stone face lying on its side, the black outline of an anchor, a column base half swallowed by mud. At first, every object appears isolated. Only slowly does the pattern form. The stones are too large to be debris from a single shipwreck. The anchors are too numerous. The pottery belongs to too many centuries. Beneath the sediment, walls continue beyond the range of the lights. What seems at first like a field of ruins becomes something far more unsettling, the remains of an urban landscape buried where no city should be. Several kilometers from the modern Egyptian coast, beneath water shallow enough for sunlight to reach on a calm day, lies the drowned city now known as Thonis Heracleion. For centuries, it survives mainly in scattered ancient accounts. Greek writers describe a harbour near the mouth of the Nile, a place of temples, customs officials, merchants, and legends. Egyptian inscriptions speak of Thonis. Greek traditions speak of Heracleion. Historians debate whether these are neighbouring settlements, two names for one place, or literary shadows of a port erased by the changing delta. No standing ruins remain on land to settle the matter. The Nile and coastline have moved. Alexandria dominates the historical imagination so completely that the older gateway to Egypt seems to vanish behind it. Then survey teams begin detecting geometric shapes beneath Abu Kirbe. Lines appear where nature usually leaves curves. Dense clusters of stone register beneath the mud. The lost harbour is no longer only a problem in ancient texts, it has coordinates. Underwater archaeology turns discovery into patience. Divers cannot brush aside the seabed and expose a city all at once. Sediment must be removed carefully, because the mud that hides an artifact also protects it. Wood survives where oxygen is limited. Metal objects retain shapes that might have vanished on land. Cargo fragments, ritual deposits, and ship timbers may lie centimetres apart. A careless fin movement can erase relationships that have survived for 2,000 years. Divers work slowly, guided by grids, measuring tapes, suction equipment, and photography. Visibility can collapse in seconds. One hand may remain on a guideline while the other searches through darkness. The work is less like exploring a palace than assembling a map from reluctant clues. Then the scale of the place begins to break through the murk. Colossal statues rise from the sediment, including figures of rulers and deities carved in the formal style of late pharaonic Egypt. Nearby lie architectural blocks from temples, inscribed stele, ritual vessels, bronze objects, jewellery, coins, ceramics, and hundreds of anchors. Some anchors remain grouped in ways that suggest designated mooring areas. Others may have been votive offerings, left deliberately in sacred water. Ancient ships are found buried in the silt, not one or two, but many, representing different construction traditions and periods of use. What survives in the record suggests a port of extraordinary intensity, a place where ships arrived continuously and cargo was transferred, inspected, taxed, stored, and redirected into the Nile system. The dramatic finds attract cameras, but quieter objects carry equal weight. A coin near a quay, a broken bowl, a lead weight, or a wooden hull peg can reveal how people moved through the city. These were not ruins created for modern wonder. They were workplaces. Sailors waited for favourable winds, priests prepared ceremonies, officials recorded goods, labourers hauled grain, wine, oil, timber, metal, and luxury objects between boats and warehouses. Foreign merchants entered a landscape governed by Egyptian institutions but open to Mediterranean exchange. Languages overlapped. Measurements had to be understood. Religious customs had to be respected. The port was not merely beside the water. Its entire existence depended on controlling movement between sea and river. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the discovery is powerful partly because it reverses the usual image of ancient Egypt. The civilization is often imagined through desert preservation, dry tombs and sunlit stone monuments. Thonis Herakleion belongs to another Egypt, one of marshes, tidal channels, reed beds, shifting sandbanks, and muddy islands at the edge of the sea. Its world is wet, unstable, and difficult to remember. The same landscape that made the port wealthy also made it vulnerable. Buildings stood on saturated ground. Harbours required maintenance. Channels changed depth. Floodwater carried both fertile silt and destructive force. The city lived in negotiation with water long before water finally covered it. Yet even the phrase lost city can mislead. Thonis Herakleion does not disappear in a single cinematic instant, and the evidence remains incomplete. Parts of it may have collapsed suddenly. Other districts may have declined gradually. Some structures likely remained visible after neighbouring ground had already sunk. Scholars still debate the sequence of submergence because the seabed preserves catastrophe, abandonment, rebuilding, and decay in overlapping layers. The city beneath the bay is not a frozen moment. It is a long history compressed into mud. That complexity is what makes the first descent so important. A diver's lamp passes across the face of a statue that once stood upright in a temple precinct. Its features are calm, almost indifferent to the centuries spent underwater. Fish move through spaces where processions may once have passed. Sand settles into carved hieroglyphs. Above, modern boats cross the bay without seeing the avenues below them. The city does not return as a complete answer. It returns as a landscape of clues. Every object proves that the ancient accounts were rooted in a real place. Yet every discovery also opens another problem. How did such a major port rise here? How did it function? And how could a city built to command the meeting point of river and sea be erased so thoroughly that even its location was forgotten? The answer begins with the landscape itself. Because before there is a harbour, a temple, or a customs house, there is the Nile dividing, slowing, and carrying an entire civilization toward the Mediterranean. The Nile does not reach the Mediterranean as a single river. Near the coast, it slows, spreads, divides, and begins to lose the force that carried water and sediment northward from deep inside Africa. In antiquity, several major branches fan across the delta before entering the sea, each creating its own corridor of navigation, settlement, and danger. Thonis Herakleion rises near the Canopic mouth, the westernmost of these important outlets, where river traffic meets Mediterranean shipping in a landscape that is neither fully land nor fully water. It is a place of mud banks, lagoons, reed beds, shallow channels, and low islands, all constantly altered by floodwater, wind, storms, and the movement of sediment. To understand the city, it is necessary to forget the modern coastline. The shore visible today does not reproduce the world known to ancient sailors. River mouths have shifted, channels have silted up, other channels have been cut by floodwaters and later abandoned. Sandbars have migrated, sections of the delta have subsided, while the sea has advanced over low-lying ground. The bay that now covers Thonis Herakleion contains the remains of a lost geography, former islands, riverbanks, harbour basins, and navigable passages that once formed a complicated threshold into Egypt. For a captain approaching from the Mediterranean, this coast would have demanded caution. The delta could appear deceptively flat and open, yet the water concealed shallow shoals capable of tearing into a hull. Sediment carried north by the Nile settled wherever the current weakened, creating bars that changed position over time. A safe passage in one season might become difficult in another. Winds from the north could oppose the river's outward flow. Storms could push seawater toward the shore. While the annual Nile flood sent an enormous volume of fresh water and suspended silt in the opposite direction, the meeting of these forces created a dynamic, sometimes violent environment. Local pilots would have been essential. They understood the channels, depths, landmarks, and seasonal changes that foreign crews could not easily read. Ships arriving from the Aegean, Cyprus, the Levant, or farther west were designed for open water travel, but entering the Nile required different knowledge. A vessel could not simply follow a straight line toward the coast. It had to navigate through controlled approaches, avoid marshy shallows, and reach suitable anchorages where cargo and officials could come aboard. The natural complexity of the canopic mouth helped make the port strategically valuable. Egypt could concentrate foreign traffic at a limited number of usable entrances, and Thonis Heracleion occupied one of the most important. The landscape offered protection as well as risk. Offshore islands, banks, and branching waterways could shelter vessels from the full force of Mediterranean waves. Ships might wait in deeper anchorages before moving into narrower channels. Smaller boats could carry goods inland through the delta, linking the harbour to settlements along the Nile. Grain from the Egyptian interior could travel downstream in rivercraft, and then be transferred to seagoing vessels. Imported wine, oil, timber, metals, ceramics, and luxury goods could move in the opposite direction. The port's location allowed it to function as a hinge between two transport systems that used different kinds of ships and different forms of expertise. The Nile's flood shaped the rhythm of this world. Each year, rising water spread across the valley and delta, renewing agricultural soil and filling channels. In the coastal zone, however, the flood could also alter navigation. It carried branches, reeds, mud, and debris. It changed depths and deposited fresh layers of sediment in harbours. Quays and channels required continual maintenance. A port in this environment was not a permanent machine built once and left unchanged. It had to be dredged, reinforced, rebuilt, and adjusted. What appears on an archaeological map as a fixed network of canals and islands was, in daily life, a system under constant pressure. The ground itself was unreliable. Delta sediments consist of layers of sand, silt, clay, and organic material laid down by water over long periods. Some surfaces could support heavy structures, while others compressed gradually beneath their weight. An apparently solid island might contain deeply saturated deposits. Buildings, temples, warehouses, and embankments altered the pressure on the soil beneath them. Engineers and labourers could strengthen shorelines with timber, stone, and packed earth, but they could not make the delta stop moving. This instability did not prevent settlement. On the contrary, the delta was one of Egypt's richest and most densely used regions. Fish, birds, reeds, fertile soils, transport routes, and access to the sea supported large populations. The challenge was learning to live within an environment that rewarded adaptation. Houses and workshops could be built on raised ground. Channels could serve as streets. Boats could move goods more efficiently than carts across wet terrain. Temple precincts and administrative centres could occupy the most secure islands, while warehouses and docks lined the waterways around them. One surprising feature of the lost landscape is the extent to which human engineering and natural geography became inseparable. Archaeological surveys suggest that parts of the city stood on a network of islands divided by canals and harbour basins. Some waterways followed natural channels, while others were likely modified or maintained for navigation. Artificial embankments reshaped the shore. Quays turned muddy edges into working waterfronts. The port was not imposed on nature in a simple act of construction. It grew by repeatedly altering a landscape that continued to alter itself. Seen from above, the ancient city may have resembled a loose constellation of built-up areas rather than a single block of streets. Temple complexes dominated certain islands. Residential and commercial districts clustered along channels. Causeways and bridges connected some areas, while boats linked others. Water was not outside the city. It ran through its centre. It determined where people lived, how goods moved, where ceremonies took place, and which parts of the settlement were most valuable. The exact appearance of the coastline at any given moment remains uncertain. Geological reconstruction can identify buried channels and former land surfaces, but the delta changed repeatedly across the centuries of the city's existence. No single map fully captures that history. What survives in the record suggests that Thonis Heracleion occupied a particularly favourable entrance during the period when it became powerful. Yet that advantage was never guaranteed to last. A channel that brought wealth could become choked with sediment. A protective bank could erode. A harbour basin could become shallower. The port prospered because it sat at the meeting point of river and sea, but it also depended on a balance that was always temporary. From the decks of approaching ships, Egypt would have appeared gradually. First came discoloured water, where the Nile's sediment spread into the Mediterranean. Then birds, reeds, and low strips of land emerged from the horizon. Beyond them lay the controlled channels of the canopic mouth and the structures of the port. Temples and administrative buildings mark the entrance not only to a river, but to a kingdom. The geography itself prepared foreign travellers for what awaited them. A passage from open sea into a landscape carefully watched, taxed, sanctified, and ruled. It was within this shifting environment that two names became attached to one remarkable city, leaving a puzzle that would survive long after the waterways around it had disappeared. For much of modern scholarship, Thonis and Heracleion appear to belong to different worlds. Thonis is an Egyptian name, preserved in inscriptions and administrative references. Heracleion is Greek, attached to stories of gods, heroes, temples, and travellers entering the Nile. One seems rooted in the machinery of the Egyptian state, the other in the literary geography of the Mediterranean. Without ruins on land and without a secure location, it is easy to imagine two neighbouring ports, perhaps one Egyptian and one Greek, standing somewhere near the canopic mouth. It is also possible to suspect that one of them is partly legendary. Ancient geography is full of places whose names shift as languages, rulers and travellers reinterpret the landscape. The confusion begins with the nature of the surviving evidence. Egyptian records are often formal and selective. They identify temples, taxes, royal acts, religious foundations, and official titles, but they do not necessarily describe a city in the way a modern map would. Greek writers preserve different concerns. They record routes, stories, sacred traditions, commercial encounters, and names made familiar to Greek audiences. A foreign visitor may hear an Egyptian place name, translate its religious meaning, or replace it with a Greek equivalent. Over generations, the translated name can become more widely known abroad than the original. Heracleion is associated with Heracles, the Greek hero whom the Romans later call Hercules. Ancient traditions connect him with Egypt and claim that he came to this region near the Nile's mouth. Another story links the port to Helen and Paris before the Trojan War, placing them in Egypt during their flight from Sparta. Such accounts belong to the flexible world of ancient myth and should not be treated as direct historical reports. Yet myths often attach themselves to real ports, temples, and roads. A sanctuary visited by Greek sailors may be interpreted through Greek religious language, even while remaining part of an Egyptian sacred system. Thonis, by contrast, carries less mythic glamour. Its name appears as part of the administrative landscape of the Delta. It is associated with the regulation of foreign commerce and with the entrance into Egypt. Officials connected to the port supervise ships and goods arriving through the Canopic branch. The city's identity is practical as well as sacred. It is a checkpoint, a market, a harbour, and a controlled gateway. For historians trying to reconcile the sources, the simplest explanation is not immediately obvious. Perhaps Herakleion is a temple district near the port of Thonis. Perhaps Thonis is the broader settlement and Herakleion a Greek quarter. Perhaps the two stand on opposite sides of a channel. The seabed eventually provides the evidence that texts alone cannot. Among the monumental objects recovered from Abukir Bay is an inscribed stone stela erected during the reign of Pharaoh Nectanebo I in the 4th century BCE. The decree recorded upon it concerns taxation on goods entering through the port and directs revenue toward the temple of the goddess Neith Sais. A closely related version had already been found at Naucrates, another major centre of Egyptian-Greek exchange. The underwater inscription names the location in a way that firmly connects the administrative city of Thonis with the sacred and commercial site known to Greeks as Herakleion. Other inscriptions strengthen the identification. The names occur in contexts that make sense only when they refer to the same urban centre or to inseparable parts of one city. What had seemed like two lost ports becomes a bilingual identity. Egyptians call the place Thonis. Greeks call it Herakleion. The difference reflects the people using the name rather than two separate settlements. This is not unusual in the ancient world. Cities at cultural frontiers often carry several names at once, especially when local religious traditions are translated into the language of foreign visitors. The reason for the Greek name likely lies in the city's principal sanctuary. At the sacred centre stands a major temple dedicated to Amun-Gereb, a form of the Egyptian god Amun associated with kingship and religious authority. Greek visitors often identified foreign deities with members of their own pantheon, searching for parallels rather than preserving exact distinctions. Amun could be associated with Zeus, while other local divine traditions might be interpreted through Heracles. The precise path by which the name Herakleion became dominant in Greek usage remains debated. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single surviving text explains the naming process in full. What matters is that the double name reveals the city's character. Thonis Herakleion is not simply an Egyptian settlement that happens to receive foreign ships. It is a place understood differently by different communities. An Egyptian official sees an administrative border and a source of royal revenue. A priest sees a sacred landscape tied to divine kingship and ritual renewal. A Greek merchant sees the harbour of Herakleion, known through Mediterranean sailing networks and stories repeated from crew to crew. These identities overlap without becoming identical. Language would have been part of daily life. Egyptian is spoken in homes, temples, workshops, and government offices. Greek becomes increasingly common among merchants, settlers, and mercenaries, especially during the first millennium BCE. Written documents may require scribes familiar with more than one system. Names change pronunciation as they pass between speakers. Measures and commercial terms need interpretation. Religious dedications can be made by foreigners using local forms. A person arriving from the Aegean might recognize the Greek name Herakleion while standing in a city whose Egyptian inhabitants call it Thonis. This dual identity also explains why the city could disappear so completely from later memory. When Alexandria rises, it absorbs trade, population, political importance, and storytelling. Older channels shift, and the drowned port leaves no visible monument on the shore. Egyptian temple traditions decline. Greek and Roman authors continue to preserve the name Herakleion, but its exact location becomes uncertain. Thonis survives in a narrower set of records. Once the connection between the two names is forgotten, the evidence fragments into separate puzzles. The underwater inscriptions do more than label the ruins. They reunite traditions that had drifted apart for centuries. A city once divided by modern interpretation becomes whole again. Its two names are not a contradiction, but a clue to the traffic that defined it. The same harbour can belong to Egypt's bureaucracy and to the imagination of Greek sailors. The same temple can be described through different gods. The same waterfront can serve royal officials, priests, merchants, translators, labourers, and travellers whose understanding of the place depends on where they have come from. On the muddy floor of Abu Qir Bay, the distinction finally loses its force. Egyptian hieroglyphs and Greek objects lie within the same drowned landscape. Anchors from foreign ships rest near temples built under Egyptian kings. Imported ceramics appear beside ritual offerings. The city's identity was never one thing. It was a meeting point, and its names preserve that meeting more clearly than any single account could. With the names joined, the scale of the port's importance comes into view. This was not merely a settlement at the edge of Egypt. For centuries, it was one of the principal doors through which the Mediterranean world entered the kingdom. Long before Alexandria becomes the celebrated face of Egypt to the Mediterranean, foreign ships approaching the Nile encounter a far older system of control. Thonis Heracleion stands at the outer edge of that system, not as an accidental marketplace, but as an organized threshold. A vessel entering from the sea does not simply sail inland and begin trading wherever its captain prefers. It reaches a watched harbour, reports its cargo, deals with officials, pays duties, and submits to rules designed to protect royal revenue and regulate contact with the outside world. Every amphora, timber beam, ingot, jar of oil, bundle of cloth, or shipment of wine passing through the canopic mouth can become a source of income and information for the Egyptian state. The port's role becomes especially important during the later centuries of pharaonic rule, when Egypt's relationship with Greek communities intensifies. Greek merchants, mercenaries, craftsmen, and settlers are already familiar figures in parts of the country, but access remains controlled. Egyptian rulers value foreign goods and military expertise while remaining cautious about unrestricted movement. Thonis Heracleion allows the kingdom to benefit from exchange without surrendering oversight. The city therefore operates as both welcome and barrier. It invites trade, yet channels it through institutions that can inspect, tax, and record what enters. A merchant arriving after days or weeks at sea would first encounter procedure. Harbour pilots guide ships through dangerous approaches. Mooring areas separate vessels by size, origin, or purpose. Officials may board a ship or summon its representatives ashore. Cargo is declared, measured, and assessed. Scribes record quantities and calculate dues. Weights must be checked against accepted standards, because a small difference becomes significant when multiplied across hundreds of jars or sacks. Seals may be applied to containers or storerooms. Goods intended for immediate sale follow one route, while cargo moving inland follows another. The decree of Nectanebo I found beneath the bay offers a rare glimpse of this machinery. It imposes a levy on goods arriving by sea and on products manufactured within the port, directing part of the revenue to the Temple of Neith at Sais. The decree shows how commerce, kingship, and religion interlock. Money gathered from foreign trade strengthens a major cult centre, while the authority of the pharaoh gives legal force to the collection. A customs payment is therefore also part of a sacred and political order. The merchant may think in terms of profit and loss, but the state presents the levy as an obligation within the proper balance of the kingdom. What survives in the record suggests that grain stands near the heart of this activity. Egypt's agricultural abundance makes it one of the Mediterranean's most important suppliers, especially when harvests elsewhere fail. Grain moves downstream from estates and storage centres in riverboats suited to the Nile. At the port, it is weighed, stored, and transferred to seagoing vessels. The process requires warehouses, labour gangs, officials, guards, and boats of different sizes. A delay caused by weather or bureaucracy can leave crews waiting while dampness threatens the cargo. Even a city associated with monumental temples depends on routine acts carrying sacks, repairing ropes, sealing jars, and keeping records dry. Imports reveal the other side of the exchange. Egypt possesses grain, papyrus, linen, stone, and gold, but it needs timber, particularly long, strong wood suitable for ships and major construction. Cedar and other woods arrive from the Levant. Wine and olive oil come in distinctive amphorae from Greek islands and coastal regions. Silver, bronze, fine ceramics, pigments, and luxury objects move through the harbour. Some continue inland toward elite households and temples. Others remain in the port, where foreign communities preserve familiar tastes and customs. The city also trades in information. Sailors bring reports of wars, alliances, piracy, harvest failures, and political upheaval. Merchants know which ports are safe and where demand is rising. Officials question captains not only because of taxes, but because ships carry news from beyond the horizon. In a world without rapid communication, a busy harbour becomes an intelligence centre. Rumours may arrive before formal envoys, and the appearance of an unfamiliar fleet can signal opportunity or danger. Control is never perfect. Smuggling is almost certainly part of the port's life, even if direct evidence is difficult to identify. Captains may understate cargoes, conceal valuable goods, or unload at smaller inlets to avoid duties. Officials may accept gifts in exchange for favourable assessments. Local boatmen know channels that outsiders do not. Scholars still debate how rigidly the customs system could be enforced across such a complicated wetland. The existence of decrees shows the state's ambition, but rules written in stone do not guarantee obedience in every warehouse or anchorage. Thonis Herakleion also regulates people. Foreigners entering Egypt may require permission, sponsors, or designated places of residence and trade. The harbour creates a zone in which outsiders can be monitored without being excluded. Interpreters, brokers, and middlemen become essential. Some are Egyptian, some Greek, and some belong to families that have lived between both cultures for generations. They understand not only language but expectation how to approach an official, which religious observances should not be ignored, and how to settle disputes before they become expensive. The port's authority is visible in its monumental setting. Customs work does not occur in a crude outpost, but beneath the presence of temples and royal images. Colossal statues remind visitors that commerce takes place under pharaonic power. Sacred precincts dominate the waterways, turning arrival into an encounter with the gods of Egypt as well as its bureaucracy. The harbour is a marketplace, but it is also a stage on which Egypt presents itself to the wider world. This position brings opportunity to the city's inhabitants. Ship owners, warehouse managers, artisans, priests, translators, innkeepers, fishermen, and labourers profit from the traffic. Imported objects enter local homes. Foreign styles appear in pottery and personal ornaments. Families build relationships across the sea, yet dependence on transit creates fragility. The city does not control the winds, the river channels, the policies of kings, or the rise of competing ports. Its importance rests on remaining the preferred gate. For a time, that gate is crowded, wealthy, and indispensable. Ships wait in its waters, taxes pass through its offices, offerings enter its temples. Cargoes begin journeys that carry them inland or across the Mediterranean. The city thrives because movement is concentrated here, and everything about its design begins to reflect that purpose. Canals become streets, basins become gathering places, and islands become specialized districts in a metropolis built around the circulation of water. From the water, Thonis Heracleon does not present itself as a single mass of walls. It spreads across a broken landscape of islands, channels, harbour basins, quays, causeways, and raised precincts, each part shaped by the movement of ships and the demands of unstable ground. The city is not arranged against the water but through it. Canals carry people and cargo into the interior. Boats pass between districts that might otherwise be difficult to reach. Temple complexes rise on the most prominent ground, while warehouses, workshops, and residential areas cluster along navigable edges. To live here is to understand that streets can be liquid and that the shortest route across the city may begin by stepping into a boat. Modern surveys of the seabed reveal traces of this fragmented plain. Lines of masonry mark former waterfronts. Dense concentrations of anchors identify places where ships gathered. Foundations suggest large buildings standing near channels that are now filled with sediment. Ancient shorelines appear beneath the bay as buried ridges and banks. Yet reconstructing the city remains difficult because the landscape changed during its occupation. Some channels were widened, redirected, or allowed to silt up. Quays were repaired, buildings were replaced. A plan that seems coherent on a modern diagram may combine structures separated by generations. The working harbours likely varied in size and purpose. Deep basins received larger seagoing vessels, while smaller craft moved through narrower waterways. Some ships anchored offshore or in sheltered roadsteads before cargo was transferred into barges. Others entered protected harbour spaces bordered by quays, timber posts, stone blocks, ropes, gangplanks, and storage yards formed the practical architecture of arrival. The port had to accommodate ships with different hull shapes, drafts, and methods of handling cargo. A merchant vessel heavily loaded with amphora required different treatment from a shallow riverboat carrying grain downstream. Along the quays, the rhythm of the city would have been physical and noisy. Labourers rolled jars across planks, lifted sacks with ropes, and dragged timber from the water. Potters supplied replacement containers. Carpenters repaired hulls damaged by long voyages or hidden shoals. Rope makers, sail menders, caulkers, metal workers, and boat builders worked close to the basins where their skills were needed. Fish were cleaned beside imported wine. Mud clung to sandals and warehouse floors. The smell of wet wood, river silt, oil, animals, smoke, and human waste mixed in the humid air. The city's monumental spaces stood within this same environment rather than apart from it. The great temple precinct of Amun-Gereb occupied a central and elevated position, accessible by waterways and processional routes. Its massive walls, gateways, statues, and sacred enclosures would have dominated the surrounding low ground. Smaller sanctuaries stood nearby, serving deities connected with kingship, fertility, protection, navigation, and the cycles of the Nile. Sacred boats played an important role in Egyptian ritual, so canals were not merely commercial corridors. They could become ceremonial routes along which divine images travelled during festivals. Causeways and bridges joined some islands. Though the surviving evidence does not allow every crossing to be reconstructed with certainty, a raised path might connect a temple to an administrative quarter. Wooden bridges could span narrower channels and be replaced when floodwater or decay weakened them. Ferries handled crossings where permanent structures were impractical. The result was a city whose internal movement depended on constant coordination. A blocked canal, damaged bridge, or collapsed embankment could disrupt trade and daily life far beyond the immediate area. Houses probably varied from substantial residences near prosperous commercial zones to modest dwellings for workers and sailors. Mud brick, the most common Egyptian building material, was practical and widely available, but vulnerable in saturated conditions. Walls required maintenance, especially where water seeped into foundations. Stone was reserved for temples, monumental gateways, statues, and selected structural elements, roofs offered space for work and sleep during hot weather. While courtyards provided light and ventilation, domestic life unfolded within hearing distance of harbour activity. Fresh water presented an interesting challenge. Although the city stood at the mouth of the Nile, the surrounding water could vary in salinity, especially under the influence of the Mediterranean. Wells, cisterns, and access to river channels may have supplied drinking water, but the exact arrangements remain uncertain. Water suitable for washing boats or moving cargo was not always suitable for people. Food storage posed similar difficulties in a damp coastal environment. Grain had to be protected from moisture, insects, and rodents. Warehouses required raised floors, ventilation, and regular inspection. Artificial islands and embankments helped expand usable space. Builders could deposit earth, mud, broken pottery, and construction debris to strengthen low ground. Timber frameworks and stone revetments held vulnerable edges in place. Over time, repeated rebuilding created thick layers of human material above natural sediments. These interventions made the city possible, but they also increased the load on soft ground. Every new temple wall, warehouse, and key pressed downward on deposits that were already waterlogged. One lesser-known detail of delta construction is that apparent solidity can be deceptive. A surface may remain stable for years while deeper layers compress slowly beneath it. Cracks emerge, walls tilt, doorways no longer align. Repairs hide the movement without stopping it. Residents may adapt gradually, raising floors or reinforcing foundations until a sudden flood or tremor exposes the weakness below. The archaeological record contains displaced blocks and collapsed structures, but it is often difficult to determine whether they fell during one disaster or through repeated episodes of failure. Despite these risks, the city was not a place of constant fear. Generations grew up regarding canals, floodwater, and soft ground as normal features of life. Children watched ships arrive from places they knew only by name. Priests crossed the water in ceremonial craft. Merchants calculated fortunes in warehouses built beside muddy banks. Fishermen worked around monumental statues. The strange landscape was home, and its complexity created livelihoods unavailable farther inland. At night, the city would have changed again. Harbour activity slowed but did not stop. Lamps burned near moorings and temple entrances. Crews remained aboard ships, listening to water against hulls and ropes tightening with the current. Voices carried easily across canals. The outlines of pylons and statues stood above low roofs, while the Mediterranean lay beyond the outer islands, dark and unpredictable. From a distance, the port may have appeared as scattered lights suspended over black water. No complete street plan survives, and scholars still debate the function of several identified basins and structures. The evidence remains incomplete because much of the city is still buried beneath sediment, yet the pattern is unmistakable. Thonis Heracleion was a true aquatic metropolis, engineered around circulation, exchange, and ritual. Its canals were arteries, its quays were working fronts. Its islands held communities whose lives depended on keeping water in the right places and buildings above it. That intricate urban system also created the setting for an unusual population, one in which Egyptians, Greeks, sailors, officials, and migrants lived close enough for goods, customs, and beliefs to cross the same channels. A port that controls the entrance to Egypt cannot remain culturally sealed. Every ship brings more than cargo. It carries accents, habits, religious symbols, cooking methods, clothing styles, and assumptions about how business should be conducted. At Thonis Heracleion, these differences accumulate along the quays until the city becomes one of the most cosmopolitan places in the late pharaonic world. Egyptians remain the dominant population, and the state remains unmistakably Egyptian. Yet Greek merchants, sailors, Mercenaries, craftsmen, and settlers are present in growing numbers. People from Cyprus, the Levant, and other Mediterranean regions pass through as well, creating a population that is constantly changing. The evidence for this mixture appears most clearly in ordinary objects. Greek amphorae arrive filled with wine or oil and remain behind after their contents are consumed. Fine painted pottery circulates among households that can afford imported goods, while simpler local vessels continue to serve most daily needs. Coins from different regions enter the marketplace, though exchange does not always depend on coinage alone. Weights, seals, and standardized containers become essential in transactions between people accustomed to different systems. A merchant may recognize the value of his cargo, but he still needs someone who understands Egyptian taxes, local measures, and the authority of temple and royal officials. Interpreters and brokers therefore occupy a powerful position. They translate words, but also intentions. A literal translation is not always enough when a contract, oath, or gesture carries different meanings in different communities. Brokers know which official must be approached and which delay can be shortened by the correct introduction. Some likely come from families established in the Delta for generations, speaking Greek in one setting and Egyptian in another. Their identities may not fit the neat categories modern historians prefer. The record preserves names and objects more readily than personal loyalties, and scholars still debate how fully foreign residents integrated into local society. Neighborhoods may have developed around language, occupation, or origin, though the underwater evidence cannot yet produce a complete social map. Sailors staying only a few days would live differently from merchants maintaining permanent warehouses. Foreign craftsmen might settle near clients who valued their techniques. Egyptian officials and priests occupied spaces tied to administrative and sacred authority. Yet strict separation would have been difficult in a city built around narrow islands and shared waterways. People met at markets, docks, workshops, ferries, and drinking places. Children growing up there would hear several languages before they understood the boundaries behind them. Food offers one of the quietest signs of cultural exchange. Egyptian staples such as bread, beer, onions, fish, lentils, and dates remain common. But imported wine becomes increasingly visible. Olive oil arrives from regions where it is central to cooking and ritual. Recipes leave little direct trace, yet animal bones, seeds, storage jars, and cooking vessels can suggest changing habits. The result is not a sudden fusion into one cuisine, but a gradual borrowing shaped by cost and availability. Clothing and personal adornment also reveal layered identities. Linen remains fundamental in Egypt, but foreign styles of jewellery, pins, and dress accessories appear in the archaeological record. A Greek merchant may wear local linen suited to the climate while retaining a foreign name and religious affiliation. An Egyptian official may own imported pottery without seeing himself as culturally Greek. Objects cross boundaries more easily than identities. The presence of a foreign-made item does not prove that its owner was foreign, just as an Egyptian religious object found near a ship does not prove that every sailor aboard worshipped Egyptian gods. Religious life produces the most visible forms of negotiation. Foreign residents entering the city encounter temples that dominate the landscape and ceremonies tied to the Nile, kingship, and the Egyptian divine order. Some participate directly by making offerings, funding dedications, or adopting local forms of worship. Others interpret Egyptian deities through Greek equivalents, seeing familiar qualities beneath unfamiliar names and images. This habit allows outsiders to approach local sacred spaces without fully abandoning their own traditions. The process creates parallels, but never perfect matches. Small votive objects suggest personal acts of devotion that official inscriptions rarely describe. Sailors facing dangerous waters may offer miniature anchors, coins, or figurines in thanks for safe arrival. Merchants may seek divine favour before a major transaction. Families may dedicate objects for health, fertility, or protection. Some offerings follow Egyptian conventions, others Greek ones, and many occupy an ambiguous middle ground. What survives in the record suggests that religion at the port was both institutional and intimate, expressed through grand ceremonies as well as private acts performed by people far from home. Cultural contact also creates tension. Foreign communities can be useful to rulers and resented by local populations at the same time. Competition over contracts, warehouse space, and access to officials may sharpen differences. Mercenaries serve Egyptian kings but remain armed outsiders. Merchants can become wealthy, while labourers carrying their cargoes remain poor. Legal disputes arise when customs conflict or when one community suspects another of receiving special treatment. No surviving account describes the full social atmosphere of Thonis Heraklion, so it would be misleading to imagine either perfect harmony or constant hostility. The city probably moved between cooperation and suspicion depending on politics. During stable periods, trade rewards, practical tolerance. During invasion, rebellion, or dynastic crisis, foreign residents may suddenly appear dangerous. Greeks themselves are not a single unified group. People from different cities and islands bring rivalries of their own. Egyptians are equally diverse in occupation, status, and regional background. The port is not divided into two simple camps. It is a crowded field of overlapping interests. Customs officials rarely improve cultural harmony, and Thonis Heraklion probably offered no exception. Yet bureaucracy also forces regular contact. Scribes, captains, priests, translators, and warehouse managers must cooperate enough to keep goods moving. Every successful transaction creates a small bridge between systems. Over decades, those bridges become embedded in family networks, business partnerships, and shared routines. The strongest symbol of this layered society is the city's double name. To Egyptians, it is Thonis. To Greeks, it is Herakleion. Both names remain valid because both communities experience the same place through different traditions. The harbour does not erase those differences. It gives them a common setting. Beneath the monumental statues and along the muddy canals, the city becomes a living borderland where Egypt meets the Mediterranean not in one dramatic encounter, but through thousands of daily exchanges. At the centre of those exchanges stands the sacred precinct, where trade, royal power, and foreign devotion converge beneath the authority of Amun-Gerib. The commercial city gathers around a sacred centre, at Thonis Herakleion. The great temple of Amun-Gerib is not an isolated religious monument standing apart from trade and administration. It is woven into the machinery of the port. Ships enter under the gaze of divine images. Taxes support temples. Kings seek legitimacy through ceremonies conducted there. Merchants make offerings before journeys. And sailors thank the gods for surviving waters that remain dangerous even when the coast is familiar. The sanctuary gives spiritual meaning to the city's position at the threshold of Egypt, turning a harbour entrance into a place where royal authority and divine protection meet. Amun is among the most powerful gods of ancient Egypt, closely connected with kingship and the hidden forces sustaining the ordered world. At Thonis Herakleion, the form known as Amun-Gerib occupies a particularly important place. The exact character of this local manifestation remains partly uncertain because the surviving evidence is fragmentary, but inscriptions and ritual objects show that the sanctuary was central to the identity of the city. The temple precinct likely included monumental gateways, courtyards, chapels, storage rooms, workshops, and sacred spaces accessible only to priests. Colossal statues of rulers and deities stood within this setting, making political hierarchy visible in stone. For a foreign visitor, the scale of the sanctuary would have been difficult to ignore. Egyptian temples were designed not simply as gathering halls, but as houses of the gods, places where divine presence was maintained through daily ritual. Most people did not enter the innermost rooms. Priests purified themselves, presented food, burned incense, clothed sacred images, and performed ceremonies intended to preserve cosmic balance. The public experienced the temple through its outer spaces. Festivals, processions, statues, and the economic activity surrounding it. At a port, that influence extended directly into the harbour. The temple controlled land, labour, goods, and revenue. It required grain, linen, oils, incense, metal, timber, and animals for sacrifice. It employed priests, scribes, guards, craftsmen, boatmen, musicians, and labourers. Storerooms received offerings and taxes. Workshops produced ritual equipment. Boats carried divine images along canals during festivals. A temple of this scale was therefore also an economic institution, and its prosperity rose with the traffic of the port. The decree of Nectanebo I, linking customs revenue to the Temple of Neith, shows how easily commercial taxation could be directed towards sacred purposes. Thonis Heracleon functioned within the same wider system, where religion and state finance were rarely separate. Royal ceremonies gave the city even greater importance. Pharaohs did not rule by military force and administration alone. Their authority depended on maintaining the proper relationship between the human and divine worlds. Temples confirmed kingship through ritual, and certain sacred centres held special roles in recognizing or renewing royal power. Evidence suggests that ceremonies at Thonis Heracleon were connected with the legitimacy of rulers, particularly during the later dynastic and Ptolemaic periods. A king arriving or being acknowledged there did more than visit a coastal shrine. He entered a ritual landscape that declared his right to govern Egypt. The waterways around the sanctuary made such ceremonies highly visible. Sacred boats could carry images of the gods from one temple to another, accompanied by priests, officials, musicians, and crowds along the banks. The divine image remained enclosed from ordinary view, but its movement transformed the city. Canals that usually carried cargo became processional avenues. Quays became viewing places. Work slowed as ritual temporarily reordered the harbour. The same water that brought foreign goods into Egypt carried the gods through the city. One of the most remarkable traditions connected with the region involves the mysteries of Osiris. Each year, rituals commemorated the death, dismemberment, and restoration of Osiris, god of the dead, renewal, and legitimate kingship. In the wider Canopic region, sacred figures were fashioned from soil, grain, and other materials, then carried by boat through the waterways. These ceremonies linked agricultural regeneration, the Nile's cycles, and the promise that death could be overcome through divine order. Archaeologists have recovered ritual objects from the submerged landscape that appear connected with these observances, including small ceremonial vessels and offerings placed deliberately in the water. The details remain debated. No complete account survives describing exactly how every ritual was performed at Thonis Heracleon, and practices may have changed over centuries. Yet the pattern is clear enough to reveal a city whose religious calendar depended on movement across water. The harbour was not merely close to sacred activity. Its channels, basins, and islands formed part of the ritual space. Darkness, lamps, incense, music, and the slow passage of sacred boats would have transformed the familiar urban landscape into something solemn and otherworldly. Foreign residents participated in this sacred world in different ways. Some approached Egyptian gods through comparison with their own. Greek visitors might associate Amun with Zeus, while Osiris could be interpreted through Greek ideas of death and rebirth. Such identifications made unfamiliar rituals easier to understand, but they also simplified traditions that were far more complex. Others adopted Egyptian practices directly, dedicating objects in local sanctuaries or seeking protection from deities connected with navigation and fate. A sailor does not need a perfect theological understanding to make an offering before crossing dangerous water. The temple precinct also reinforced social divisions. Priests possessed specialized knowledge and access. Officials displayed status through proximity to sacred ceremonies. Wealthy donors could place prominent dedications, while poorer worshippers left small objects, food, or coins. The gods were presented as protectors of order, but that order included hierarchy. Colossal statues did not merely inspire devotion. They reminded every visitor who ruled, whose institutions controlled the harbour, and how small an individual appeared beside royal and divine power. At the same time, religion provided continuity in a city defined by movement. Ships came and went. Foreign crews stayed briefly. Floods altered channels, and political regimes changed. The temple offered a sense of permanence. Its rituals repeated on established days. Its priesthood preserved names, formulas, and sacred duties. Its walls and statues gave the impression that the city rested on an unchanging divine foundation, even while the ground beneath it was anything but stable. This contradiction lies near the heart of Thonis Heracleion. The sanctuary proclaimed cosmic balance in a landscape of shifting sediment. Kings presented themselves as guarantors of order in a port vulnerable to storms, floods, and unstable soil. Sacred processions moved confidently across waters that could erase embankments and undermine foundations. For generations, ritual and engineering held the city together. The gods travelled the canals, merchants filled the warehouses, and royal authority was renewed beneath towering stone figures. Around that sacred centre, the harbour continued to accumulate another kind of evidence vessels lost, abandoned, repaired, or deliberately placed in the mud, preserving the working life of the port more clearly than almost any ancient text. The mud around Thonis Heracleion holds ships the way a library holds books. Some survive only as scattered planks and fastenings. Others preserve enough of their structure to reveal how they were built, repaired, loaded, and finally lost. Together they form one of the richest collections of ancient vessels ever found in a single harbour environment. Their importance lies not in any one dramatic wreck, but in the number and variety of boats buried across the drowned city. They belonged to different periods, served different purposes, and reflected several traditions of shipbuilding. The harbour was used for so long and by so many kinds of craft that its seabed became an archive of maritime life. Most ancient ships disappear almost completely. Wood decays when exposed to air, worms, bacteria, and changing moisture. A vessel broken on an open coast is scattered by waves. Timbers are reused, burned, or stripped of valuable fittings. In the waterlogged sediment of Abukir Bay, however, oxygen is limited. Mud settles over hull fragments and protects them from rapid decay. The same silting that troubled ancient sailors preserves the remains for archaeologists. Beams, joints, planks. And pegs survive where almost everything above them has vanished. The vessels are not identical. Some are broad, shallow boats designed for the Nile and Delta channels. Others are more suited to coastal or open sea travel. Their construction reveals a world in which shipbuilding knowledge moved between regions but did not become uniform. Egyptian builders developed techniques shaped by the river, local materials, and long traditions of joining wooden components. Mediterranean shipwrights brought methods familiar from Greek and Phoenician ports. At Thonis Heracleion, these practices existed side by side and sometimes influenced one another. One especially significant group resembles the kind of Egyptian river vessel described by the Greek historian Herodotus. He wrote of boats made with short lengths of wood, arranged in a distinctive pattern and reinforced internally. A description that puzzled scholars because no surviving example had been securely identified. A wreck found in the submerged harbour preserves construction features remarkably close to his account. Its thick planks are fitted together with long internal ribs, creating a robust hull unlike the more familiar Mediterranean vessels assembled with carefully joined planking. The discovery does not prove that every detail in Herodotus is correct, but it demonstrates that he was describing a genuine Egyptian tradition rather than inventing an exotic curiosity. Ships of this type were practical for river transport. They could carry heavy cargo while operating in relatively shallow water. Their construction made use of shorter timber pieces, useful in a country where long, straight wood was scarce and often imported. The Nile itself supplied the route, but boats remained essential to the economy that depended on it. Grain, stone, animals, pottery, people, and building materials moved more efficiently by water than across difficult roads. When these vessels reached Thonis Heraklion, they entered a zone where river navigation met the demands of the sea. Seagoing ships waited in deeper water or protected basins. Cargo might be transferred from one vessel to another, a process requiring coordination and considerable labour. Amphorae had to be handled without breaking. Grain had to remain dry. Heavy stone, timber, or metal required ropes, ramps, and teams of workers. A mistake could send valuable goods into the harbour. Broken jars and lost objects accumulated near quays, creating deposits that now help identify working areas. The anchors are equally revealing. Hundreds have been documented across the site, including stone anchors of different shapes and sizes. Their distribution shows where ships gathered and how harbour spaces were used. Some lie in dense clusters, suggesting crowded mooring zones or repeated anchoring over long periods. Others appear in ritual contexts near sacred areas. An anchor could be practical equipment, but it could also become an offering. Sailors who survived a dangerous journey might dedicate one to a god, turning an instrument of security into a symbol of gratitude. Not every vessel found in the harbour sank in a sudden accident. Some may have been abandoned after becoming too damaged to repair. Others could have been dismantled, with useful wood removed and the remaining hull left to settle into the mud. Storms may have driven ships against quays or shallow banks. Fires, collisions, leaks, and overloading were ordinary maritime dangers. A harbour crowded with vessels, small craft, ropes, and floating cargo would have experienced frequent mishaps. The evidence remains incomplete because identifying the final event in a ship's life is difficult. A hull found beside a collapsed structure may have sunk during the same disaster, or it may have been buried there decades earlier. Sediment can shift objects after deposition. Later construction can cut through older wrecks. Scholars still debate the exact dates and functions of several vessels, particularly when only partial timbers survive. Yet even uncertain wrecks contribute to the broader pattern. Ship maintenance formed a constant part of port life. Hulls leaked, planks loosened, ropes frayed, sails tore, marine growth slowed vessels and damaged submerged surfaces. Carpenters inspected seams, replaced timbers, and applied materials intended to resist water. Small repairs could be made while a ship remained afloat, but larger work required hauling it into shallow water or onto a prepared bank. Workshops near the harbour would have stored tools, pegs, rope, timber, and substances used for sealing joints. The ships also carried private worlds. Crews slept aboard, cooked simple meals, stored personal possessions, and maintained religious objects for protection. A vessel might contain men from several cities who shared danger more readily than language. Long waits in port created opportunities for trade, drinking, argument, illness, and desertion. The grand political function of Thonis Heraklion depended on these ordinary crews, many of whom left no names in the historical record. A lesser-known possibility is that some boats had ceremonial roles. Egyptian religion made extensive use of sacred vessels, both real and symbolic. Divine images travelled in ornate boats during festivals, while smaller models were placed in temples or tombs. In a city where processions moved along canals, certain craft may have been maintained specifically for ritual journeys. Their construction, decoration, and treatment would have differed from that of cargo boats. though fragmentary remains do not always allow archaeologists to identify them with confidence. Seen together, the wrecks transform the city from a collection of monuments into a living harbour. They reveal the technologies that connected Egypt to the Mediterranean and joined the delta to the interior. They show that the port depended on constant movement, repair, adaptation, and risk. Every anchor marks a moment when a crew expected to depart again. Every abandoned hull records the point when that expectation ended. For centuries, ships continued to arrive, but the balance of power along the coast was beginning to change. A new city was rising nearby, built to command the sea on a scale Thonis Heracleon could not match. The new city rises less than a generation after Alexander the Great enters Egypt in 332 BCE. Its site lies west of the old Canopic mouth, on a narrow strip between the Mediterranean and Lake Machaotis, where access to sea routes can be combined with routes into the Nile Valley. Alexandria is planned with extraordinary ambition. Broad streets cross at measured angles. Harbours are protected and enlarged. A causeway links the mainland to the island of Pharos, creating separate basins and reshaping the coastline. Royal palaces, administrative quarters, temples, warehouses, and naval facilities follow. What begins as a strategic foundation becomes the capital of a new kingdom, and the consequences reach Thonis Heracleon almost immediately. The older port does not vanish when Alexandria appears. For a time, the two cities operate within the same maritime system. Thonis Heracleon still possesses functioning harbours, experienced officials, sacred prestige, and established commercial networks. Ships continue to arrive. Temples continue to receive offerings. Customs duties are still collected. Yet the centre of gravity is moving. Alexandria is not merely another port competing for cargo. It is the seat of the Ptolemaic court, the headquarters of royal administration, and the place where rulers concentrate wealth, military power, and international display. The Ptolemies understand the political value of a harbour visible to the wider Mediterranean. Their dynasty is Macedonian in origin, governing an overwhelmingly Egyptian population while presenting itself to Greek-speaking elites as a major Hellenistic power. Alexandria becomes the perfect stage for this double identity. Greek institutions, royal monuments, Egyptian cults, and imported traditions stand beside one another under court patronage. Diplomats, scholars, merchants, soldiers, and adventurers are drawn toward the capital because decisions are made there. Infrastructure accelerates the shift. Alexandria's harbours can serve large fleets and accommodate extensive storage, ship repair, and military organisation. The city is connected to Lake Machaotis and from there to canals leading toward the Nile, allowing goods to move between the Mediterranean and the interior without relying entirely on the older Canopic gateway. Engineers alter channels and build facilities on a scale supported by royal revenue. The lighthouse on Pharos becomes both a navigational aid and a declaration of power. Sailors approaching Egypt now see a monument announcing that the principal entrance lies here. For Thonis Heracleon, the change is gradual enough that many inhabitants may not initially recognize it as decline. A warehouse still fills with grain, a priest still conducts the same festival. A ship from the Aegean still anchors in the familiar basin. The city retains advantages that cannot be transferred overnight. Local pilots know the channels. Merchant families maintain long-standing relationships. The temple of Amun-Gereb continues to hold ceremonial importance, particularly in rituals connected with royal legitimacy. Even Ptolemaic rulers have reason to honour the older sacred centre. This persistence matters because cities rarely die the moment a rival is founded. Trade networks are stubborn. Buildings, offices, and religious duties create inertia. Some cargo may still enter through Thonis Heracleon before moving toward Alexandria or farther inland. Smaller vessels continue to use its protected waters. Regional markets depend on its workshops and storage areas. The port may even benefit temporarily from increased maritime activity under the Ptolemies as Egypt becomes more deeply integrated into Mediterranean commerce. But the kind of traffic matters as much as the amount. The most valuable political and commercial functions increasingly gather around the new capital. Royal grain administration expands through Alexandrian institutions. Foreign embassies arrive there. Naval fleets assemble there. Major merchants seek residence near the court. Artisans, scribes, financiers, and labourers follow the opportunities created by population growth. Each movement weakens the older city not through sudden abandonment, but through the steady loss of priority. The harbour landscape itself may have contributed. Alexandria occupies a site that can be fortified, monumentalized, and connected to deep water more effectively than the shifting islands of Thonis Heracleion. The old port remains exposed to silting, channel migration, and the maintenance demands of the delta. Dredging and embankment repair require labour and money. Once the state's greatest investments flow elsewhere, problems that were previously managed can become persistent. A neglected channel grows shallower. A quay remains damaged longer after a storm. Captains begin to prefer more reliable facilities. The evidence does not show a single official decision closing Thonis Heracleion. No decree survives announcing that its age is over. Archaeology instead suggests continuing occupation through the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, even as its role changes. Coins, ceramics, repairs, and construction indicate that people remain. The city becomes secondary, but secondary does not mean empty. It may function as a regional harbour, religious centre, fishing settlement, and supporting port within the orbit of Alexandria. Some residents adapt. Merchants divide operations between both cities. Families send younger members to the capital while retaining property in the old port. Boatmen carry goods along routes linking the two. Priests emphasize ceremonies that Alexandria cannot easily replace. Local workshops serve markets overlooked by larger suppliers. Decline, from the perspective of those living through it, may feel less like collapse than a series of practical adjustments. Others lose ground. Officials whose authority once depended on controlling the main maritime entrance see their influence reduced. Warehouses stand partly unused. Inns receive fewer wealthy crews. Skilled workers leave for better wages. Tax income falls, making public maintenance more difficult. The monumental centre remains impressive, but the resources required to preserve it become harder to obtain. A city built around concentrated movement suffers when that movement is redirected. There is also a change in memory. Alexandria quickly generates stories about itself. Its library, scholars, palaces, lighthouse, royal intrigues, and cosmopolitan population dominate ancient accounts. Visitors describe the new capital because it is where power resides. Thonis Heracleion, once the place through which outsiders entered Egypt, becomes an older name on the edge of the narrative. Its temples remain sacred, but its commercial significance is increasingly described in the past tense. Scholars still debate the speed and extent of this transition. The archaeological sequence is incomplete, and different districts may have prospered or declined at different times. Political centralization, altered waterways, competition, and environmental strain likely work together. Alexandria did not destroy Thonis Heracleion. It made the older port easier to neglect. That neglect became dangerous because the city's foundations had always depended on constant intervention. Beneath temples as warehouses and houses, the saturated delta sediments continued to compress. Without the same level of maintenance and investment, old vulnerabilities grew harder to conceal. Cracks widened, shorelines weakened, and parts of the ground began to behave less like land than the waterlogged deposits they had always been. The first signs of failure may have been easy to dismiss. A crack opened along a warehouse wall. A quay settled slightly lower than the stones beside it. Water appeared in a place that had once remained dry. A doorway shifted out of square, and a floor had to be raised above a layer of damp silt. In a delta city, none of this would have seemed extraordinary. Buildings required repair everywhere, and residents of Thonis Herakleion had lived for generations with floods, erosion, and unstable banks. The danger lay in the fact that the ground was not simply being worn away at the surface. Beneath the streets and temples, saturated sediments were slowly losing their ability to carry the weight above them. The city stood on deposits laid down by the Nile sand, clay, silt, decaying vegetation, and water trapped between countless grains of sediment. These materials could support structures when pressure was distributed carefully and conditions remained stable. But stability in a river delta is never permanent. New layers accumulated, old layers compressed, and groundwater moved through the soil. Heavy stone temples placed enormous loads on ground that had formed gradually from mud and sand. Artificial islands added more weight. Embankments, warehouses, statues, and quays increased the pressure further. Compression could continue almost invisibly for decades. Water was forced from pores in the sediment, allowing grains to settle closer together. The surface lowered by small amounts, sometimes unevenly. One part of a building sank while another remained fixed. Twisting walls and opening fractures, repairs concealed the evidence without removing the cause. Workers patched masonry, inserted supports, rebuilt waterfronts, and raised floors. The city survived because people constantly corrected the movement beneath it. This gradual sinking, known as subsidence, affected much of the delta, but local conditions could make it severe. Buried river channels were especially dangerous. A building erected across an old channel might rest partly on firm sand and partly on soft, organic mud. From the surface, the difference was invisible. Beneath the foundations, however, the two materials responded differently to weight. The firmer ground remained relatively stable, while the softer deposits compressed. Walls tilted toward the weaker zone, large stone blocks separated along joints. A temple that appeared solid enough to last forever could be slowly pulled apart by the forgotten path of a river. One surprising feature of this process is that the most impressive buildings could be among the most vulnerable. Monumental stone architecture appears more permanent than mud brick housing, yet its weight creates greater stress on weak soil. A modest structure might bend, crack, or be rebuilt without catastrophic failure. A massive gateway or statue base could concentrate thousands of tons on a limited area. If the sediment beneath it shifted, the collapse might be sudden and impossible to stop. Water made every weakness worse. As parts of the city subsided, they became more exposed to flooding. Salt water entered during storms or periods of high sea level. River floods overtopped weakened banks. Once water reached a low district, it saturated walls, undermined floors, and washed fine sediment from beneath foundations. Drainage became harder because the land no longer stood high enough above surrounding channels. Pumps did not exist to rescue entire neighborhoods. Laborers could build new barriers and fill sunken areas, but each intervention added more weight. The process created a dangerous cycle. Subsidence increased flooding. Flooding weakened structures and sediments. Repairs added material to the surface, which increased pressure and encouraged further subsidence. As long as the port remained wealthy and strategically important, the city could invest in maintenance. When trade and royal attention shifted toward Alexandria, that balance became more difficult to sustain. A quay repaired every few years might now wait longer. A protective wall might be rebuilt with cheaper material. Damage that had once been treated as urgent became part of the background of decline. There may also have been episodes of more dramatic ground failure. Waterlogged sand can behave unpredictably when shaken. Under ordinary conditions, friction between grains allows the sediment to support weight. During intense vibration, however, water pressure between the grains can rise until the soil briefly loses much of its strength. The ground begins to behave like a dense liquid. Buildings sink, tilt, or slide. Foundations fail even when the structures above them remain largely intact. This process, called soil liquefaction, is one of the leading explanations for some of the destruction found beneath Abu Qir Bay. An earthquake need not have split the earth open beneath the city to cause severe damage. Shaking from a regional event could have been enough to destabilize saturated deposits. Walls might collapse into canals. Quays could move outward toward deeper water. Entire blocks might descend unevenly, carrying statues and architectural elements with them. Archaeologists have found large stone objects lying in positions consistent with structural failure. Though reconstructing the exact sequence remains difficult, late occurrence, collapses, and human activity disturbed many of the original relationships. Liquefaction is compelling, but it does not explain everything by itself. Some districts appear to have sunk at different times. Certain buildings were repaired after earlier damage, suggesting that the city experienced repeated episodes rather than one final catastrophe. Erosion, flooding, earthquakes, sediment compaction, and sea level change may all have contributed. Scholars still debate how much weight to assign each process. The evidence remains incomplete because the submerged ruins preserve outcomes more clearly than causes. Residents would have experienced these failures at a human scale. A family might wake to find water entering a courtyard after an unusually high tide. A warehouse owner might discover that a wall had separated from its foundation. Priests might close part of a sanctuary while damaged stones were reset. Boatmen could notice that familiar steps along a quay disappeared beneath the surface. None of these events alone announced the death of the city. Together they changed what could be trusted. The psychological effect is difficult to recover, but the physical evidence suggests a community adapting to increasingly unreliable ground. Floors were rebuilt, structures were reinforced, new construction appeared beside damaged areas. People did not abandon the city at the first sign of danger because their work, homes, temples, and family networks were there. Ancient populations were accustomed to environmental risk, and departure carried risks of its own. Yet there comes a point when repair stops restoring the old order. A district lost to water becomes a shoreline, a collapsed channel becomes a harbour edge. Buildings that cannot be saved are stripped for useful stone. Movement concentrates on the remaining high ground. The city contracts around whatever still functions. What had once been an aquatic metropolis begins to fragment into isolated pockets of occupation. Beneath the surface, pressure continues to build in the saturated sediments. Above it, storms, floods, and perhaps earthquakes test structures already weakened by centuries of settlement. The ground does not fail everywhere at once, and that makes the final history harder to tell. Thonis Heracleion is not waiting for one simple disaster. It is caught inside several processes, each capable of worsening the others, until the distinction between gradual decline and catastrophe becomes almost impossible to draw. No witness leaves a complete account of the day Thonis Heracleion went under, because there may never have been such a day. The city's disappearance is often imagined as a single catastrophe, an earthquake in the night, the ground suddenly turning liquid, temples collapsing, and the sea rushing over the ruins. That image is powerful, and parts of it may reflect real events. Yet the submerged landscape resists simplicity. Different structures appear to have failed at different times. Some districts were repaired after major damage. Occupation continued after parts of the city had already become unstable. The evidence points not to one clean destruction layer, but to a sequence of shocks, floods, subsidence, erosion, and abandonment. Earthquakes remain central to the debate because the eastern Mediterranean is tectonically active. Powerful earthquakes have repeatedly affected Egypt's northern coast. Even distant shaking can travel through soft sediments and cause severe local damage. A temple on firm ground may crack, but one over waterlogged delta deposits can lose its foundation almost instantly. Columns tilt, walls separate, and heavy statues fall as the ground beneath them settles unevenly. The most destructive effect may not have been the shaking itself, but liquefaction. When saturated sand is disturbed violently, pressure rises in the water trapped between its grains. For a brief period, the sediment can no longer support heavy loads. Buildings sink or slide. Quay walls move toward open water, and entire blocks descend. This process matches some of the remains in Abukir Bay. Monumental stones lie where foundations failed, and sections of the ancient landscape collapsed into lower basins. Yet assigning every ruin to an earthquake creates problems. Stone blocks may fall for many reasons. Foundations weaken gradually. Floodwater removes sediment. Walls are dismantled for reuse. Currents shift material after submergence. Without a written record tied to a destruction layer, dating failure is difficult. Coins and pottery establish broad periods, but rarely show whether a building collapsed suddenly or decayed over generations. Scholars still debate which known earthquakes, if any, correspond directly to the destruction phases. Floods offer another part of the explanation. The Nile was the source of Egypt's fertility, but unusually high inundations could be devastating in the delta. Water overtopped embankments, undermined walls, and cut new paths through low ground. If the river changed course even slightly, a formerly protected island might find itself exposed to stronger currents. Structures built to manage ordinary floods could fail under an exceptional one. The sea attacked from the opposite direction. Mediterranean storms can drive water toward the coast in surges. In a landscape already close to sea level, a temporary rise can flood large areas. Waves break over outer banks. Salt water enters canals, and moored ships strain against anchors. Storms also erode shorelines and damage barriers. Once an embankment is breached, repeated surges enlarge the opening and make future flooding easier. A tsunami is sometimes proposed as the decisive event. The Mediterranean has produced destructive tsunamis, and coastal sites preserve evidence of sudden marine inundation. A large wave reaching the Canopic coast could have carried ships inland and overwhelmed low islands. It remains plausible, especially if triggered by an earthquake. But the evidence at Thonis Heraklion does not require a single enormous wave, and no securely identified tsunami deposit explains every part of the site. Popular accounts favour this explanation because it offers a dramatic final moment, yet the archaeological picture is more complicated. Long-term sea level rise worked quietly behind these disasters. The delta surface also moved downward through subsidence. What mattered was relative sea level, the height of the water, compared with the land on which people lived. Even a slow rise transformed the consequences of storms and floods. Quays built at a safe elevation became too low. Groundwater rose beneath buildings. Salt penetrated farther inland. Areas that once flooded rarely began flooding regularly. Shoreline change added another layer. The Nile deposited sediment, but currents and storms redistributed it unevenly. One part of the coast advanced while another eroded. Sandbars formed and disappeared. Harbour entrances became blocked, forcing crews to use different routes. If a major river branch carried less water, it deposited less new sediment and lost some ability to resist marine erosion. The land did not simply sink beneath a steadily rising sea. The entire coastal system was rearranging itself. Human intervention may have intensified the vulnerability. Buildings and artificial fills loaded the soft ground. Dredging altered sediment movement. Quays redirected currents, sometimes protecting one district while increasing erosion elsewhere. Rebuilding on damaged structures added weight to already compressed deposits. The inhabitants did not create the disaster through ignorance. Their engineering sustained the city for centuries. But every successful effort to hold the landscape in place also created new stresses. The port's declining importance shaped how these hazards were managed. When Thonis Heraklion controlled major trade, royal authority and temple institutions could mobilize labor for dredging, repairs, and flood defences. As Alexandria drew away commerce and investment, the older city had fewer resources. A weakened embankment that once would have been rebuilt quickly might remain damaged through another storm season. Environmental pressure became more dangerous as the city's capacity to respond shrank. Final submergence was probably uneven. One quarter may have been lost after a sudden ground collapse. Another remained occupied on higher land for decades or centuries. Temples continued functioning after nearby waterfronts failed. Some ruins may have stood partly above water, visible to fishermen long after regular settlement ended. The city became an archipelago of remnants before it became a seabed. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Earthquakes can trigger liquefaction, but they do not explain centuries of subsidence. Floods can destroy embankments, but not every fallen monument. Rising water increases vulnerability, yet gradual change alone does not account for sudden structural failures. Storms, erosion, human engineering, economic decline, and tectonic shocks work together, each making the next event harder to survive. That is why the disappearance of Thonis Heracleion feels both dramatic and strangely quiet. There were almost certainly moments of terror, but also years of ordinary retreat. People repaired walls, abandoned flooded rooms, shifted boats to new moorings, and carried sacred objects away from buildings that could no longer be trusted. The city did not pass from life to death in one instant. It crossed a series of thresholds until the remaining population understood that the port their ancestors had built was no longer recoverable. What followed was not immediate oblivion, but a slower abandonment in which ruins, stories, and names drifted apart until the city survived more clearly in legend than on any map. Abandonment rarely begins with an official declaration. There is no final ceremony in which the people of Thonis Heracleion gather their possessions, extinguish the temple lamps, and agree that the city has ended. Instead, occupation thins. A family leaves a flooded house and does not return. A merchant relocates his business to Alexandria but keeps a storeroom in the old port for a few more seasons. Priests continue rituals within a reduced sacred precinct, while outer buildings stand damaged. Fishermen use channels that once carried foreign fleets. The city remains inhabited, but fewer parts of it remain truly urban. As low districts become difficult to defend, residents retreat toward whatever ground still appears secure. Houses are stripped of reusable timber and stone, roof beams, doors, bronze fittings, and dressed blocks are too valuable to abandon. A fallen monument may become a source of construction material. Quays once repaired to serve international shipping are maintained only enough for local boats. Channels clog with silt. Waterways that had functioned as streets become marshy inlets where reeds take root. The remaining population lives among visible reminders of greater prosperity. Empty warehouses line waterways that no longer receive large cargoes. Administrative offices lose their purpose once customs traffic is redirected elsewhere. Marketplaces shrink. Workshops close or serve a smaller regional demand. The city's monumental scale begins to exceed the needs and resources of those who remain. A community can inhabit ruins for generations without restoring the world that created them. Religious life may persist longer than commerce. Temples often preserve meaning after political and economic centres move away. Pilgrims continue to visit familiar sanctuaries, and priests maintain rituals because sacred authority does not depend entirely on the number of ships in a harbour. The mysteries associated with Osiris and the cult of Amun-Gereb tie the city to traditions larger than local prosperity. Even rulers centered in Alexandria have reasons to respect older religious institutions, particularly when those institutions support claims of legitimate kingship. Yet temples also require resources. Roofs leak, walls crack, sacred equipment deteriorates, and priestly staffs must be supported. When income falls, ceremonies may be shortened or consolidated. Sections of a precinct can be closed while worship continues in a smaller area. Sacred objects may be transferred to safer temples. Inscriptions do not record every such decision, leaving archaeologists to infer decline from repairs, abandoned structures, and the final dates of offerings. Political change further weakens continuity. Egypt passes from Ptolemaic rule into the Roman Empire, and the institutions governing trade, taxation, and religion are reorganized. Alexandria remains the dominant port, now serving Roman demands on an immense scale. Egyptian grain travels across the Mediterranean to feed imperial populations. Thonis Heracleion still occupies a useful coastal location, but it no longer controls the principal stream of wealth. Later changes in the river system may have isolated it even further. The Canopic branch gradually lost importance and eventually ceased functioning as one of the Nile's major outlets. As water flow diminished, channels silted more rapidly. Navigation became harder. A port exists only while ships can reach it, and a harbour cut off from both reliable river traffic and major sea routes becomes a contradiction. Buildings may remain, but the reason for the city's location disappears. Some areas likely vanish beneath water while others were still occupied. Residents may have watched familiar structures collapse or become surrounded by shallow lagoons. A temple wall could remain visible above the surface even after its courtyard flooded. Broken columns might mark dangerous shoals. Sailors and fishermen learned to avoid submerged masonry. For a time, the ruins were not lost at all. They were part of the local landscape, remembered by communities who knew what had stood there. Memory, however, is vulnerable to population change. If the descendants of the city's inhabitants moved away, their knowledge became detached from the place. New settlements developed along different shorelines. The coastline continued to shift, and landmarks disappeared. Names survived in texts, but the physical points to which those names referred became uncertain. A ruined temple visible in one century could be completely submerged in the next. The gradual nature of the disappearance helps explain why ancient writers provide no universally recognized account of its end. Sudden disasters attract chronicles. Slow retreat produces scattered references, administrative silence, and stories that no longer match geography. There may have been destructive earthquakes and floods remembered locally, but those memories were absorbed into the wider history of a coast repeatedly struck by disaster. Heracleion remained alive in Greek and Roman tradition because of its sacred associations. The name evoked Heracles, Helen, Paris, and an Egyptian temple near the mouth of the Nile. Such stories preserved a sense that an important place had existed there, yet they did not preserve accurate coordinates. Myth is durable precisely because it does not require a functioning harbour. It can travel through books and retellings long after the keys themselves disappear. Thonis survived differently, through Egyptian inscriptions and official references that became increasingly difficult to interpret once the city was gone. Later scholars encountered two sets of evidence and tried to place them within a coastline that no longer resembled the ancient delta. Without visible ruins, the idea that Thonis and Heracleion were the same city remained uncertain. Some maps placed them separately. Others treated Heracleion as a legendary sanctuary or a minor settlement, whose importance had been exaggerated by ancient writers. Alexandria's fame deepened the silence. Its lighthouse, library, palaces, scholars, and political dramas dominated accounts of Mediterranean Egypt. Even Alexandria itself suffered earthquakes, subsidence, and the loss of coastal districts beneath the sea, creating its own field of submerged ruins. Against that vast historical presence, the older port faded almost completely. The city that once introduced foreign visitors to Egypt became a footnote beside the metropolis that replaced it. Local fishermen may have encountered pieces of its past without recognizing the whole. Nets caught on stone, divers found isolated objects, Columns and statues lay beneath sediment in water too murky to reveal their arrangement. A single artifact could be explained as cargo from a wreck or material carried from another site. Only the pattern on the temples, streets, anchors, ships, and inscriptions together could demonstrate that an entire city rested below. Mud completed what changing memory had begun. Sediment covered walls and protected fragile remains while concealing their form. Marine growth softened the outlines of carved stone. Canals filled until the ancient plan became indistinguishable from the natural seabed. Above the ruins, the bay returned to an appearance of emptiness. The disappearance was therefore both physical and intellectual. Land became water, monuments became obstructions, and two names became separate historical puzzles. What remained was an uneasy collection of stories about a sacred harbour somewhere near the Nile's western mouth. The city had not been erased. It had been hidden beneath a landscape that no longer offered obvious clues, waiting for methods capable of seeing through water and mud. The search for Thonis Heracleon begins not with a diver touching stone, but with a problem of scale. Abu Qir Bay covers a broad and complicated seafloor shaped by river sediment, ancient shorelines, modern currents, shipwrecks, and centuries of human activity. The lost city could not be found by sending divers into the water at random. Visibility was too poor, the sediment too deep, and the suspected area too large. Before excavation could begin, archaeologists had to learn how to see a buried landscape without removing it. Frank Goddio and the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology approached the bay as a survey problem. Historical texts offered clues, but those clues were imprecise. Ancient writers described temples, ports, and river mouths that no longer existed in recognizable form. Modern maps reflected a coastline altered by subsidence and erosion. The first task was therefore to reconstruct the geography beneath the water and identify places where natural formations gave way to human patterns. Survey boats moved slowly across the bay along carefully planned lines. Instruments measured depth, magnetism, and the structure of sediment below the seabed. Side-scan sonar sent sound pulses outward and recorded the echoes returning from objects and changes in surface texture. Stone walls, wreckage, and exposed blocks could produce shapes unlike ordinary sand. Magnetometers detected disturbances caused by metal objects or concentrations of material affecting the local magnetic field. Sub-bottom profilers sent acoustic signals into the sediment, allowing researchers to identify buried layers, former channels, and structures hidden beneath mud. None of these instruments produced a clear picture of a city. Their results appeared as bands, shadows, anomalies, and changes in density. A strong reading might indicate a wall, a shipwreck, geological material, or modern debris. Interpretation required comparison across several methods. When different surveys showed straight lines, right angles, dense clusters, and repeated patterns in the same area, the likelihood of architecture increased. The city began to emerge not as a visible ruin, but as a statistical and geometric disturbance in the seabed. Positioning was essential. Every anomaly had to be recorded precisely so divers could return to it, and so discoveries could be placed within a larger map. Underwater, a few meters of error could mean searching blindly in darkness. Surface navigation systems tracked survey vessels while acoustic equipment helped establish the positions of divers and objects below. Over time, thousands of measurements accumulated into a detailed coordinate network. The first descents confirmed that the instruments were detecting more than scattered wreckage. Divers encountered monumental stone blocks, architectural fragments, anchors, statues, and pottery within patterns suggesting streets, basins, and sacred precincts. The finds were not distributed randomly. They belonged to an organized settlement covering a large area. What had been a set of ancient references now became a physical city whose scale could be measured. Excavation underwater demanded methods adapted to an environment where every movement disturbed visibility. Divers established grids over selected areas and removed sediment with controlled suction devices. These tools carried loosened mud away while allowing archaeologists to expose objects gradually. Brushes and hand tools were used around fragile materials. Once the sediment began to move, however, the water could turn opaque. Teams often worked by touch, following measured lines and relying on procedures rehearsed in clearer conditions. Objects were documented before removal. Photographs from multiple angles helped preserve their position. Measurements recorded orientation, depth, and relationship to nearby features. Increasingly, photogrammetry allowed hundreds or thousands of overlapping images to be combined into three-dimensional models. A statue, wreck, or section of temple foundation could be studied digitally even after sediment was replaced or the object was raised. Large monuments created extraordinary engineering challenges. A colossal statue lying in mud cannot simply be tied to a rope and pulled upward. Stone that survives centuries underwater may contain cracks, weakened surfaces, or fragile inscriptions. Sediment supports part of its weight, and removing that support changes the forces acting upon it. Archaeologists and engineers designed lifting frames, slings, and flotation systems that distributed pressure carefully like the object was freed in stages, and monitored and raised slowly enough to avoid uncontrolled movement. The moment a monument broke, the surface was dramatic, but it was only the beginning of another long process. Salt water had penetrated pores and fractures. If the stone dried too quickly, salts could crystallize and damage the surface. Metal objects faced rapid corrosion once exposed to oxygen. Waterlogged wood could shrink, split, or collapse as moisture evaporated. Conservation teams stabilized artifacts through controlled cleaning, desalination, chemical treatment, and gradual drying. In some cases, preserving an object took far longer than finding it. Not everything was raised. Most of the city remained underwater, and much of it remained buried. Excavation is destructive in the sense that once a layer is removed, it cannot be replaced in its original state. Archaeologists therefore opened selected areas to answer specific questions, while leaving others protected by sediment. The goal was not to empty the bay, an impossible and unnecessary ambition, but to understand the city through representative evidence. The team also had to distinguish ancient context from a later disturbance. Abu Qir Bay contains material from many periods. Ships crossed it for centuries after Thonis Heraklion declined. Modern anchors dragged across ruins. Fishing equipment disturbed the seabed. Currents moved smaller objects. Large earthquakes affected the coast repeatedly. A coin found beside a wall might date the occupation of that area, or it might have arrived much later through sediment movement. Each interpretation depended on surrounding evidence. One surprising result of the mapping was the recognition that the lost city extended across a much larger and more complex landscape than early expectations suggested. Harbours, canals, islands, and temple zones formed an integrated system. The ruins were not concentrated around one monument. They spread through an urban environment whose arrangement reflected centuries of rebuilding and shoreline change. The identification of inscriptions naming the city transformed the survey from a probable discovery into a historical breakthrough. Thoni and Heraklion could finally be placed within the same submerged landscape. Ancient descriptions that once seemed vague began to align with the physical evidence. Temple remains, customs activity, maritime traffic, and bilingual culture all occupied the same geographic setting. Even then, certainty came slowly. Archaeology rarely offers the clean moment of discovery imagined in popular stories. The city was recognized through repeated seasons of mapping, diving, recording, conservation, and comparison. Every answer depended on dozens of smaller observations. A line of blocks helped define a quay. A cluster of anchors revealed a mooring zone. A buried hull identified the edge of a channel. An inscription connected a monument with a name. The bay gradually changed from apparent emptiness into a layered map. Beneath modern water lay medieval and Roman material. Beneath that lay Ptolemaic and late Pharaonic structures. Below the city were older sediments and abandoned river courses. The search revealed not only ruins, but an entire history of landscape transformation. What the surveys uncovered was far more than confirmation that the city had existed. The seabed had preserved the evidence needed to reconstruct how its temples, harbours, officials, sailors, and ordinary households functioned together. In the objects still lying beneath the water, the grandeur of Thonis Heracleon and the routine sustaining it waited side by side. The seabed preserves Thonis Heracleon unevenly, but that unevenness is part of its power. Monumental statues lie near broken bowls. Royal decrees rest within the same drowned landscape as fishing equipment, coins, tools, and cargo containers. The result is not a carefully arranged museum of ancient Egypt. It is a disrupted city in which sacred grandeur and ordinary work survive side by side. Each object belongs to a different scale of life, yet together they reveal how the port functioned from the highest levels of kingship to the smallest routines of the waterfront. The colossal statues are the most immediate reminders of authority. Carved rulers and deities once stood upright within temple precincts, towering over worshippers and foreign visitors. Their size was deliberate. In a low, flat delta landscape, monumental stone figures transformed the approach to the sanctuary. They made royal and divine power visible from a distance. Even merchants concerned primarily with cargo and customs could not enter the city without passing through a setting designed to impress upon them the order of Egypt. Underwater, those same statues appear vulnerable. Some lie face down in sediment, others rest on their sides, their surfaces darkened by centuries beneath the sea. Their fall records the failure of buildings and ground that once seemed permanent, yet their preservation also protects details that might have been destroyed on land. Facial features, crowns, inscriptions, and clothing styles help identify rulers and divine figures. Tool marks reveal carving techniques. Damaged bases show how the statues were mounted and where structural stress may have caused them to topple. Large inscribed stelae provide a different kind of evidence. Their hieroglyphs preserve names, decrees, religious dedications, and administrative decisions. One inscription can connect a submerged structure with a known ruler or institution. Another can reveal how taxation worked or which temple received revenue. These texts turn anonymous stone into historical testimony. They also expose the close relationship between sacred language and practical government. A decree about commercial duties may be carved with the same formality as a religious dedication, because both express the authority of the king. Smaller inscriptions are equally valuable. Labels on objects, dedicatory texts, names on statues, and marks made by craftsmen can identify people otherwise absent from history. Some record elite donors, while others may preserve only a brief name or sign. Many objects remain difficult to interpret because erosion has damaged their surfaces, and scholars still debate several readings. The evidence remains incomplete. But even partial texts can confirm cultural connections and help date activity within particular districts. Coins provide another form of chronology. They pass rapidly through hands, markets, and ships, often travelling far beyond the place where they were minted. A coin found in a harbour deposit may help establish the earliest possible date for the layer containing it, though it could remain in circulation for years before being lost. Groups of coins reveal periods of intensive activity and patterns of exchange. Their images also reflect political change, shifting from pharaonic symbols to the portraits and designs of Ptolemaic and later rulers. Most coins were probably lost in unremarkable ways. One slipped from a merchant's hand near a quay, Another fell between floorboards or into shallow water. A small payment intended for food or labour disappeared into mud. Such losses are insignificant to the people who made them, but together they trace movement through the city. Dense concentrations may indicate markets, administrative spaces, or busy waterfronts. A single coin cannot reconstruct a neighbourhood, but hundreds begin to create patterns. Ceramics are even more abundant. Broken pottery survives almost everywhere because fired clay is durable and because ancient cities depended on containers. Amphorae carried wine, oil, fish products, and other commodities. Large jars stored grain or water. Bowls, plates, cooking pots, lamps, and cups filled houses, inns, workshops, and ships. Their shapes and clay compositions often reveal where they were made, allowing archaeologists to follow trade routes across the Mediterranean. Imported vessels show connections with Greek islands, the Levant, Cyprus, and other regions. Local imitations reveal how foreign forms were adapted by Egyptian potters. Changes in ceramic styles help track the city's shifting population and commercial networks. Yet pottery can be deceptive. An imported jar does not prove that its owner came from the same region. Containers were reused, traded, and refilled. A Greek amphora might end its life storing an Egyptian product or serving as construction fill beneath a floor. Ritual objects open a quieter window into belief. Bronze figurines, small vessels, offerings, and ceremonial equipment were placed in temples, channels, and sacred basins. Some were deposited deliberately and never meant to be recovered. Their value lay in the act of giving. Sailors may have offered objects after surviving difficult passages. Merchants sought success or protection. Priests performed ceremonies in which materials were lowered into the water as part of larger religious cycles. Water itself could mark a boundary between human and divine space. An offering placed in a sacred channel entered an environment beyond ordinary use. The fact that archaeologists recover such objects centuries later does not turn them into accidental losses. Context matters. A bronze figure found alone in a working harbour may have fallen from a ship, while a concentration of similar objects near a sanctuary suggests intentional deposition. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires careful mapping. Tools and working equipment reveal the city beneath the ceremonies. Weights, measuring devices, rope fittings, hull fastenings, fishing gear, and fragments of workshops point toward the labour sustaining the port. Stone and metal weights allowed merchants and officials to compare quantities across systems. Their accuracy affected taxes and profits. A dishonest weight could enrich one person while damaging many others, so standards were matters of both commerce and authority. Personal objects restore some sense of the individuals moving through these institutions. Jewellery, amulets, pins, beads, gaming pieces, and small containers belong to people rather than monuments. An amulet may express fear, devotion, or family tradition. A decorative pin can hint at clothing and status. A gaming piece suggests waiting sailors delayed by weather, workers resting, or residents filling hours after the markets closed. These objects survive without the stories of their owners, but they narrow the distance between the drowned city and ordinary experience. Animal bones, shells, seeds, and food remains add another layer. They reveal what people ate, what they imported, and how they used the surrounding wetlands. Fish were abundant, but different species indicate different fishing grounds and techniques. Grain, fruit, legumes, and animal products moved through kitchens and markets. Botanical remains are difficult to preserve and recover underwater, yet when found they can expose details no monument records. The grand and the ordinary constantly overlap. A ceremonial vessel may have been made in a workshop beside a noisy quay. Grain taxed by royal decree was carried by labourers whose names are lost. Colossal statues depended on boatmen, stone handlers, craftsmen, and crews capable of transporting immense blocks through shallow channels. Temple festivals required food, rope, oil, linen, and repaired boats. Sacred splendor rested upon practical systems. That is perhaps the clearest lesson of the seabed. Thonis Heracleion was not only a city of temples, legends, and kings. It was a working port whose magnificence emerged from thousands of repeated tasks. The mud preserves both faces at once. A royal image lies near a merchant's weight. A sacred offering rests beside a broken cooking pot. A decree survives near the hulls of vessels that carried the goods it taxed. The city returns not as one dramatic object, but as a web of relationships. Every statue required a temple. Every temple required revenue. Every tax depended on cargo. Every cargo depended on ships, labour, weather, and navigable water. Beneath Abu Qir Bay, those relationships remain visible enough to reconstruct, yet incomplete enough to leave the final story open. Even after years of surveying and excavation, most of Thonis Heracleion remains concealed. The mapped ruins extend across a vast submerged landscape, but only selected areas have been opened. Walls continue beneath layers of mud. Ship timbers disappear beyond excavation grids. Temple foundations lie under sediment thick enough to hide entire phases of construction. Every season of work adds details while making the scale of the unknown more obvious. The city has been found, but it has not been exhausted. In many ways, its most important discoveries may still be buried. One unanswered question concerns the city's beginnings. Archaeology confirms that Thonis Heracleion flourished as a major port during the later 1st millennium BCE, but the earlier history of settlement near the canopic mouth remains less clear. The favourable location must have attracted fishermen, pilots, traders, and officials before the city reached monumental scale. Older structures may lie beneath later temples and harbour works, yet reaching them would require removing the very layers archaeologists need to preserve. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate when the settlement first became an organised gateway rather than a cluster of communities along navigable channels. The development of the harbour also raises questions. Survey maps reveal basins, canals, quays, and islands, but these features did not all exist at the same time. Some were natural waterways modified by human labour. Others may have been excavated or enlarged deliberately. Shorelines moved, new embankments were built, and older districts were abandoned. Reconstructing a single city plan risks flattening centuries of change into one moment. The real Thonis Heracleion was repeatedly redesigned in response to commerce, politics, sediment, and water. Its population remains equally difficult to measure. Imported pottery, Greek inscriptions, Egyptian monuments, and foreign ship types demonstrate cultural diversity, but they do not reveal precise numbers. It is unclear whether Greek merchants lived in concentrated quarters, spread across the port, or shifted between temporary and permanent residence. Marriage, bilingual families, converted religious practices, and shared business networks leave traces that are often ambiguous. Material culture shows contact, yet the inner lives of the people who created it remain largely beyond reach. The Temple of Amun-Gereb holds further mysteries. Its importance is certain, but the full sequence of rituals conducted there is not. Sacred objects found underwater suggest processions, offerings, and ceremonies associated with royal legitimacy and the mysteries of Osiris. Still, archaeologists possess fragments rather than a complete religious calendar. The meaning of a ritual vessel depends on where it was placed, what accompanied it, and whether the deposit remained undisturbed. A single object can support several interpretations, none of which fully reconstructs the ceremony once performed around it. The city's destruction is the largest unresolved problem. The submerged ruins preserve evidence of collapse, subsidence, erosion, and flooding. But these forces overlap. Geological studies can identify unstable sediments and former channels. Fallen monuments can reveal the direction of structural failure. Pottery and coins help date occupation. Yet no method can replay every disaster in exact order. Perhaps one major earthquake destroyed a large district, followed by gradual flooding. Perhaps repeated smaller events did more damage than any single catastrophe. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire drowned landscape. Future research may separate these events more clearly. Sediment cores can reveal marine incursions, flood layers, and sudden disturbances. Microscopic analysis can identify whether deposits were laid down by river water, storms, or powerful waves. Improved dating methods may narrow the periods in which particular structures failed. Digital mapping can combine architectural remains with geological data, showing where buildings stood over especially weak ground. The city is becoming a laboratory for understanding how human construction interacts with unstable coastal environments. That relevance extends far beyond ancient Egypt. Modern cities around river deltas face many of the same basic pressures: subsidence, sediment loss, coastal erosion, storm surges, rising relative sea levels, and the concentration of heavy construction on soft ground. Their technologies are different, but the landscape obeys the same physical principles. Concrete towers, sea walls, drainage systems, and pumps can delay danger without eliminating it. Thonis Heracleion offers no simple prophecy. Yet its ruins demonstrate how prosperity can encourage people to treat a temporary balance as permanent. The comparison must be made carefully. Ancient inhabitants did not possess modern geological knowledge or engineering systems, and the scale of present-day climate change introduces forces different from those acting on the old port. It would be misleading to claim that every coastal metropolis is destined to share its fate. What the city offers is not a prediction, but a warning about confidence. A harbour can function successfully for centuries and still depend on conditions that gradually shift beyond its ability to respond. Its story also complicates the idea of collapse. Thonis Heracleion was not destroyed solely by nature. Alexandria redirected wealth and political attention. Changing trade routes reduced investment. Religious and administrative institutions weakened. Environmental hazards became more severe partly because the city had fewer resources to manage them. Disaster emerged from the meeting of physical vulnerability and human change. The ground failed. But so did the economic system that had once paid to reinforce it. This pattern appears repeatedly in history. Communities often survive familiar hazards while their institutions remain strong. Floods are repaired, walls rebuilt, channels dredged, and damaged homes restored. The same hazards become catastrophic when political conflict, declining revenue, migration, or neglect reduces the capacity to recover. Thonis Heracleion therefore disappeared not merely because water rose over land, but because the balance connecting environment, engineering, commerce, religion, and government came apart. The city's preservation adds a final contradiction. The mud that swallowed streets also protected them. Submergence destroyed houses and temples, yet it sealed wooden ships away from oxygen. Sediment concealed inscriptions but kept them from later stone robbers. Water erased the visible city while preserving an archaeological archive of remarkable richness. Disappearance and survival occurred through the same process. Each new excavation must therefore weigh discovery against protection. Removing an object makes it available for study, but also exposes it to deterioration. Opening a wreck reveals construction details, yet breaks the sealed environment that preserved the wood. Much of the site may be safest where it is, buried beneath sediment. The unfinished nature of the research is not simply a limitation. It is a deliberate form of conservation, leaving evidence for future archaeologists with better methods. Above the site, the bay continues to move. Fishing boats cross ancient temple precincts. Currents carry sediment over quays and statues. Modern anchors threaten areas that survived earthquakes and floods. Pollution, coastal development, and unauthorized removal create additional risks. Protecting a submerged city is difficult because its boundaries are invisible and its remains cannot be guarded like monuments on land. Still, Thonis Herakleion has already altered the history of the Mediterranean. It restored a missing gateway to Egypt, reunited two ancient names, confirmed descriptions once treated with suspicion, and revealed a maritime world hidden behind the more familiar image of desert monuments. It showed that late Pharaonic Egypt was deeply connected to foreign trade while retaining powerful systems of royal and religious control. It also demonstrated that an entire urban landscape can disappear without leaving an obvious ruin above water. The city beneath Abu Qir Bay is no longer lost in the strictest sense. Its location is known, its name restored, and parts of its history reconstructed. Yet it remains unreachable in another way. Most of its inhabitants are nameless. Its final disasters cannot be arranged with certainty. Its streets can be mapped, but not walked as they once were. The city has returned as evidence rather than experience, and every recovered object marks the boundary between what can be known and what time has withheld. The water above Thonis Herakleion is rarely still. Even on quiet days, currents move across the bay, lifting grains of sediment and laying them down elsewhere. The city continues to change beneath that slow movement. A carved face disappears under a thin veil of mud. The edge of a quay becomes visible for a season, then vanishes again. Fish pass through the broken entrance of a sanctuary whose priests once believed their ceremonies helped preserve the order of the world. Perhaps this is the final image the city leaves behind, not a single moment of destruction, but the long conversation between human ambition and a landscape that never promised permanence. The people who built here were not foolish. They understood water better than most societies of their age. They read currents, maintained channels, strengthened islands, and created wealth at the precise point where river and sea met. Their success lasted for centuries. That duration matters as much as the ending, but every civilization depends on arrangements it cannot completely control. Rivers change course, harbours lose depth, governments move their attention elsewhere, temples empty, trade finds a shorter road. The structures that once appeared essential become unnecessary, and the labour required to preserve them becomes harder to justify. Decline begins quietly, often while daily life continues with enough familiarity to make the future seem secure. Thonis Herakleion reminds us that disappearance is not the same as erasure. A city can leave the surface of the world and remain present beneath it. Its stones retain the weight of kings. Its anchors remember crowded waters. Its broken pottery preserves meals, transactions, and ordinary hands. Its ships, sealed in darkness, still contain the logic of builders whose names are gone. The bay does not return these memories willingly. They must be found slowly, measured in poor visibility, protected from the air, and interpreted without forcing certainty where none survives. That patience may be the most fitting tribute to the city. Thonis Herakleion was created through generations of accumulated labour, and it is being understood in the same way, one block, one inscription, one buried hull at a time. Above the ruins, sunlight moves across the Mediterranean. Beneath it, the old gateway to Egypt rests in silence, neither entirely vanished nor fully recovered. The river no longer follows the route that made the city powerful, and the sailors who once searched for its temples would not recognize the coast. Yet below the moving water, the harbour remains where it fell, holding its final cargo of stone, wood, memory, and mud.